Welcome, everyone. This is week 2 of Faithful Conversations about the 1619 Project, which was born out of Faithful Voices for Racial Justice, a project of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. I am Connie Ryan, Executive Director and moderator for the conversation. We are very glad you have joined us to listen to some of Iowa's faith leaders. We hope you will allow it to inform and to challenge you and your conversation. The goal of the New York Times, the 1619 Project, is to, quote, reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country, end quote. Reframing the narrative is to center the voices of Black Americans and the Black community in the conversation, rather than the communities that hold power, those who benefited from racism and slavery and discrimination historically, and those who continue to benefit today. As the 1619 Project warns, quote, there is gruesome material in these pages, materials that readers will find disturbing. That is, unfortunately, as it must be. American history cannot be told truthfully without a clear vision of how inhuman and immoral the treatment of Black Americans has been. By acknowledging this shameful history, by trying hard to understand its powerful influence on the present, perhaps we can prepare ourselves for a more just future, end quote. The readings for week 2 include The Idea of America by Nicole Hannah-Jones and Chained Migration by Taya Miles. You can find the links to all the readings through the New York Times website or the Pulitzer Center websites or at faithful-voices.org. I am very pleased to have with me 3 of Iowa's faith leaders to be in conversation about the issues lifted up in the reading and to do so from their faith lens. We have Reverend Fred Gaddy, pastor at St. Paul's AME Church in Des Moines, Rabbi Linda Bertenthal, rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Davenport, as well as Congregation Beth Israel in Davenport, and Reverend Lizzie Gilman, pastor at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Des Moines. Thank you to the 3 of you for joining the conversation. And I'm going to start with the first very simple question on the list of questions that everyone else has as well. And we're going to start with Reverend Gilman. What surprised you about the history in today's readings?
Thank you, Connie. So I'm going to say I was surprised by a lot. And because I am the first one to answer this question, perhaps it's appropriate that I start at the beginning where I was surprised. So when I learned about Jefferson and the other founders who were originally going to put in into the Declaration of Independence language around slavery, I learned that they were going to scapegoat slavery by blaming the King of England for forcing this institution on unwilling colonists. And then I learned at the very beginning of our readings that perhaps instead of taking responsibility or even scapegoating, all of this language just didn't appear at all. It was, it's almost, what is that term? It's like gaslighting slavery as by not mentioning it. And this sin became the nation's own. It was not the British, but it was ours alone.
Thank you, Lizzie. Rabbi Linda, do you have thoughts on what surprised you most?
Most. That's hard.
Well, just
I
surprised me.
had never read that preservation of slavery was a major cause of the Revolutionary War or the Mexican-American War either. That was pretty shocking to me. If I did know from my legal training that the Constitution forced non-slave states to return refugee escaped slaves, I must have blocked that out because it absolutely horrified me when I read it. And I must say that I've always thought of Lincoln, in favorable terms, and the idea that he wanted to basically deport Black Americans after freeing them was really dreadfully shocking to me.
And Pastor Fred, if you would add in what surprised you?
Well, I think the thing that surprised me the most was the story about the Mexican-American War. But what surprises me about the whole project is people are surprised by the project. That's what really gets me. And as a person who was raised in Detroit in the late 60s and the early 70s, these issues were always being discussed during that particular time. I guess a little radical. People were making these discoveries that are in this thing, and I'm just amazed at how little people knew about the history of slavery. And I think it's just a part of that whole let's just ignore it and maybe it'll go away. And it's still hard, very hard, especially here in Iowa, for people to deal with the fact that America isn't all that hasn't been kind, hasn't been good, and has been pretty darn cruel.
Yeah, I was raised in California. And in California, what they teach the school children is, there were some there were some states in the South that made this huge mistake of enslaving people, but we fixed that. And California never had anything to do with any of that. And, we were a good state, right? They didn't tell us California tolerated slavery till the Civil War. They didn't tell us California ever outlawed marriages that it considered to be interracial. I mean, that was what?
Yeah, I grew up in Iowa, and one of the very first stories that you read of a family in Waterloo and hearing about the segregation in communities in Waterloo, I grew up in Iowa with that colonized narrative that no, we were a northern state. So I specifically remember teachers calling Iowa some of the good guys. We were the good guys. And a lot of this reading is, it is very intense, but it sheds a light on all of these dark spots of history that I just didn't know about.
I have to say, for my school education, I had no idea that slaves made it up 20% of the population of the 13 colonies. It was always presented as like this little tiny thing that was kind of happening off to the side, not like, this huge, enormous thing that was actually what was building the country. It's just so misrepresented in our textbooks. And now here we are moving towards more massively misrepresenting it. It's just kind of ghastly.
So I want to bring in your faith into this conversation. And one of the questions that is on our list of questions for week 2 is, what does what you are learning in today's readings affirm, stretch, or challenge your faith and your faith tradition? And Rabbi Linda, my apologies, I meant to say this ahead of time. I told you I was going to forget. I'm going to start with you on this question. Where does your faith come into this? How does it affirm and stretch in what you're reading and challenge you through the lens of your faith?
So I'm going to start by saying it really affirms Judaism's call to the necessity of what we call teshuvah, which is often translated as repentance, but it's more like turning and realigning yourself. What we teach about teshuvah is that when you've done wrong, you have to regret it. You have to acknowledge it. You have to redress the harm that you've done. that you have to vow to not to repeat it. And when the opportunity arises to repeat it, you don't do it. And only then are you actually able to go and ask God for forgiveness for that sin. And this is a process America has never come close to. And I know that it can be done in a national way because we saw it in Germany after the Holocaust. They underwent this national process of tshuva. And I really believe with all of my heart that this is something America needs to do, that it's way past due at this point, but it still would help us so much if we went through that process, like even just regretting and acknowledging. But, all of the stages are so important. The redressing of the harm done is like very controversial, even among people who would call themselves liberal. What it challenges so deeply. I mean, it always horrifies me that the Hebrew scriptures don't outlaw slavery. They don't. They have two categories of slavery. They have Hebrew slavery and what's called Canaanite slavery. And the Canaanite slavery, allows someone to be enslaved for all their life and for their children to be enslaved because they were. And so the kind of majority view of this in Judaism is that slavery was such an ingrained human institution, you couldn't just kind of cure it all overnight. So instead, Torah put all these limitations on slavery, things like, the fact that you couldn't return a fugitive who had escaped slavery and took refuge in a city. They couldn't be returned to their master. And there were like different kinds of restrictions that kind of kept slaves from being dehumanized and treated badly. And if you mistreated a slave, you had to free them. And so there's limitations. And the majority view is that was supposed to kind of roll out down through the centuries until finally we completely obliterated slavery. But honestly, Torah completely outlaws all kinds of things. And some of them, it says, are even punishable by death. And so it's like a pain to me that it doesn't outlaw slavery. And even as late as 18th century, there were some Jewish scholars that affirmed the right to hold non-Jewish people as slaves. We're talking like 1700s Amsterdam. And that horrifies me. But on the other hand, what I really want to affirm about Judaism is that there's all these parts of Jewish tradition that must cause us to hold slavery repugnant, from the everyone created equally in God's image all the way through, that our master story of Exodus and the ethos that we derive from it, that we're supposed to strive for everyone to be free and, free treatment, fair treatment of workers and all of those things. So like Judaism should have from the beginning prohibited slavery, and it hurts me that it didn't.
Reverend Gaddy, do you want to talk a little bit about from your faith lens, your faith perspective?
Yeah, I think it affirms what is a pretty basic tenet of the African American church, is that we believe God no matter what the circumstances. And so why the people didn't rebel, why the people didn't kill, why are Americans, where can Black Americans find any room to be patriotic? And it comes from this whole fact that we believe deep down in our hearts that God is in control of the world, and that one day it will be right. But also it served to me as a reminder that certain things can't happen unless there's confession, and that what we have is no confession and no acknowledgement that anything was done wrong. And I think the problems that we have in working together and living together come from the fact that, that we cannot admit, especially white people, admit that things were done wrong to these people. No matter how many stories you read, people are over to come, well, that wasn't me. And it's like, but just like Rabbi Linda was saying earlier, in Germany, they apologized even and continue to apologize to this day, whether they were part of the Nazi regime. But here, it's hard to get states and places in this country to say, hey, we were wrong. We treated people badly. We still treat people badly. And this was wrong. This was wrong. And I think until we do that, it affirms my faith that things won't change, because it's got to be to get reconciliation, to get true reconciliation. Just saying forgive me doesn't work, because I don't believe. I'm just speaking for me. I don't believe you, because if you're not moving in a direction that says I want to right some of these wrongs, then you'll just be in the next chapter.
I really appreciate you saying that, because repenting isn't just saying sorry and moving on, but it's turning our hearts, turning our minds, turning ourselves towards God and away from this sin. And yes, as a white person, I will say that we have an incredible amount of work to do. And we have an incredible amount of work to do in the church as well. So when I was going through these questions and I was thinking about these questions, I actually thought about a lot of times when I had been stretched. And when I got into reading a lot of this material, I kept having this image come into my head, and it was from seminary when I was taking an ethos and spirituality course specific to the Episcopal Church. And our professor, he just put up on this screen in the classroom, he was showing us these beautiful pictures of churches. And I remember admiring the beautiful baptismal fonts, the pulpits, just the lovely architecture. And there was one church where they had boxed pews, and I had seen boxed pews before. And then around the perimeter on a second level of the church, there was seating just right above the box pews, so people could still see down and they could see people in the boxes. And I raised my hand. I said, okay, that's a really weird configuration for a choir loft, because I had assumed that it was for choirs. But no, it was actually if Black slaves were invited to go to church, then they would sit separately up top, where it was hotter in the South in the summer. And so they would sit separated from the rest of the congregation if they were invited to go. And because I'd always thought of the Episcopal Church as a very progressive institution itself, until I started getting into the complacency and the complicity of the Episcopal Church during this time. And so when I was reading about the Dred Scott decision and all of the attitudes around the Dred Scott decision, it really got me thinking about this attitude of races being completely separate, and how white people considered themselves so superior that Black people were actually subhuman to them. And we can see this in the Episcopal Church. Let me see, I wrote this down because I didn't want to forget about it. After the Civil War. And after the Civil War, when there were influences of Black clergy, after Absalom Jones was ordained the first Black priest in the Episcopal Church, and more Black clergy were ordained, suddenly there was this Black exodus after the Civil War, and people of the church blamed the radical North and the Black clergy and the ideas and the theologies of the Black clergy for people of the church leaving Episcopal churches in the South. So I thought that was very interesting.
I think that's really interesting about the Episcopal Church. A couple of years ago, I was teaching a class at sponsored by Virginia Theological Seminary, the Episcopal Seminary in Alexandria, and being on that campus during, I think, around the day that Martin Luther King was killed, they always have this reconciliation type of day, and they are acknowledging that many of the buildings on the campus had been built by slaves, and yet at the same time there was this glimmer of hope in the whole story, because at one time there was a Black seminary, a Bishop Payne Seminary, also in Virginia, and when it went, and instead of letting it go belly up, it merged into Virginia Theological Seminary, Virginia Theological Seminary in, I guess, maybe the early part of the 20th century or something like that. But it was like at a time when children in Virginia and people in Virginia were not integrating. So, there's always hope. And that's the good part about the whole thing.
There's a quote in the writings of Nicole Hannah Jones, and I wrote the quote down. I did not write down who said it, so I'm gonna have to go back and look at what that was, and folks can look it up. It's on page 26. I wrote the page number down, didn't write the writer down. I apologize. But the quote is, "Black people have seen the worst of America, yet somehow we still believe in its best." And I think it goes to that notion, Reverend Gaddy, of what you're talking about, hope. And each of you have talked about hope in some way or another. And to close us out, talk a little bit about that notion of hope, but also that notion of reconciliation, or what you were talking about, Rabbi Bertenthal, of what has occurred in Germany, and tying those two pieces together for our nation. How do we tie together that notion of hope, being the best that we should have been all along, and perhaps could be at some point in time, and reconciliation? What does it take to bring that together from your faith perspective? And I'm going to start with Reverend Gaddy on that.
This is really a difficult thing for me. I'm going to be honest with you, because I think the church is very divided. We have very conservative, very conservative, fundamentalists, whatever types of churches that absolutely deny that racism even exists. And to me, that is that brings damnation on the whole church. Because if you can sit in a pulpit and say, well, things aren't bad, things never were bad. People, it's sort of like the slaves were happy. Black people were always given there's no real discrimination in America. And this is being preached in fundamental churches or conservative churches across the country. And it's like, well, I think that really stretches us, because it's like, well, people aren't crazy, and they can see that some of this stuff is just not true. And so I think that really puts a challenge on the progressive church and the Black church to really tell the truth in love, if that's possible. I think it is.
Rabbi Bertenthal, your thoughts?
Well, I think talking about truth is really important, Reverend. I was very taken by Nicole Hannah Jones's own quote when she said, "The United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie." Mm-hmm. And I think that ideal, like everyone in this conversation holds up, and we want to be moving towards that ideal, but we have to deal with the lie. I think there's a certain danger in the rhetoric of, like, we just have to go back to our founding ideals, because the founding ideals themselves, weren't seen in an equal way. That founding ideals themselves, had that high language, but also the lie built in. And if we don't confront that lie and tell the truth, then I don't see how we can move forward. And yet, I have hope it just because like the Black Lives Matter, events that I participated in and have seen around the country, there are so many more people involved, so many people of a variety of races and faiths involved. I do think there are more people who are starting to at least get a glimmer of the truth. Some people who are starting to at least think the truth maybe matters in this, important issue. And I think, the more people who care, the closer we're getting to that moment where we can confront the lie together and actually start forging a new truth together.
Reverend Gilman? Yep, go ahead.
Thanks. So, Rabbi Linda, you said the more people who care, and that just really stuck out with me because even in Des Moines, where the Black liberation movement is strong and is gaining in numbers, and we have organizations like Mutual Aid of Des Moines, where people are coming together in community to assist each other and to learn and to want to grow. And in this learning and wanting to grow together is where I see hope. I see hope in people who are gathering and watching right now because they want to learn and they want to engage this material and they want to move forward. And so I do see a lot of hope there. We have an incredible amount of work ahead of us, and I see that. But when we do this work and we do this learning, and we're able to face these truths in love, like Reverend Gaddy said, then it does make it easier to do it in a community, in a supportive community where we can tell these hard truths together, and we can move along together, because when we move together, we often bring more people.
Thank you to all three of you, to the faith leaders that have really dug into this material, and I am grateful to each of you and for your presence and for your efforts in Iowa. I want to thank each of you who are watching. Your willingness to listen and engage in the conversation is critically important for our nation and communities to dismantle racism and move toward an equitable democracy. A heartfelt thank you to our team of faith leaders who designed Faithful Conversations about the 1619 Project and who participate in Faithful Voices for Racial Justice each week. Thank you again. Please, as I often say, register to vote or help someone else register to vote. It matters in our democracy. And for now, be well and take care.